We're discussing this iconic life in studio with our eNCA senior researcher Angelo Fick and political analyst Karima Brown, who have both been watching the story unfold, and essentially history being made this afternoon as the nation bids this icon farewell. Angelo, I want to bring you into the conversation here. We often look at the ANC Women's League in these times, and many analysts describe this organ of the ANC as a shadow of its former self. What was the ANC Women's League like under the leadership of Winnie Mandela?
Well, I think firstly we need to place her in the historical context. This woman was 5 years younger than my own mother, so she comes out of a generation of the 1930s. And so when we get into the 90s, she's a woman, shall we say, who has come into her own. The kind of issues that many younger women face was not what she was facing at that time. And she brought to the Women's League the kind of firebrand radical ideas, and not just ideas at the level of ideology, but of performance in politics that had not been there before to the same extent. So the respectability politics, for example, of the 1980s about how women should behave had been, in a sense, undone by Winnie Mandela in her role from 1993 onwards. That women struggling, so much of what we see as post-apartheid, shall we say, women's rights issues, had been guaranteed by a Women's League in the negotiations process of the 1990s prior to 1994, and particularly in that period 93 to 94. So issues of women's rights to reproductive health, for example, abortion, issues of women's equality, notions of women as not just secondary citizens, was precisely the kinds of issues that the Women's League was pushing for in the early 1990s, which saw a feminist agenda entering politics and forcing the African National Congress. And it's not just Winnie Mandela, but all of those women in the movement, both in the Women's League but in the ANC itself, that pushed for those kinds of rights. It was the only party that put gender at the center of the agenda in the negotiation process, and insisted on the, shall we say, guarantees of women's rights to equality in all sorts of ways, precisely because at that point it was already recognized under Mandela's leadership that this was not just a kind of struggle for nationalism and for national freedom, that there was a particular gendered component, given how colonialism and apartheid as an extension of colonialism rendered black women like children. And so that, I think, issue needs to be acknowledged. But also, very importantly, most of us live very ordinary, or are ordinary people living in extraordinary times. But Winnie Mandela, there is no denying, was an extraordinary human being living through extraordinary times. And so it's not just a matter of kind of, do we like her, do we not like her, is she positive or is she negative? But the extraordinary contribution of this very extraordinary woman, I think, as Karima Brown indicated, cannot yet be conceived of because it has been so soon since her absence from the larger stage of South Africa's politics.
Karima, we were speaking a moment ago about the fact that it would be commonly accepted in this country that Winnie Mandela was a born leader. And yet she had a disregard for authority and didn't do particularly well as a member of parliament.
No, absolutely. In fact, she, I think, was fined a couple of times for being absent for long periods of time. It was really interesting because Winnie Mandela had always gravitated toward younger people, toward militancy, toward people who were urgent about change. She didn't like sitting in long meetings, deliberating. She was a woman of action. But when governance came and when the ANC had to make that transition from a liberation movement into a government, she was one of the leaders who found it really, really difficult because suddenly there were sets of rules, there were attendance registers, you had to pitch and you had to pitch on time and you couldn't come with your entourage. So she was also a bit of a diva and everybody accepted that, of course. And I mean, she was this larger than life character. I remember often when she came to Esamu, who's also passed away, he was a judge. He handled a lot of the Madiba case. So whenever she had to go to Robben Island, she had to via Issa Musa's office. And when she arrived, there was this flurry of activity and everyone would gravitate around her because she had gravitas, she had that presence and she commanded attention. And as you correctly say, she was a born leader. But as many leaders go, she didn't always play by her own rules. And so she she was sometimes caught, bunking Parliament, for example. And I think that what was really interesting was that people like Winnie Mandela shouldn't necessarily have become parliamentarians. We should have been more creative to find ways in which their leadership could be brought to bear on society at large without putting them, in the strictures of having to be a government minister. But I mean, the African National Congress was fresh out of exile. What did it know about how to construct a state? So Winnie Mandela was also very much part of that learning curve, Joanne, of understanding what it means to move from a liberation movement to become a governing, party. And consistently, I mean, the one image that is seared in my memory among so many is, of course, when she tried to upstage Thabo Mbeki and she came late, and he got up and he hit her hat off her head. And I hope we have the visuals that we can show, but it was such an iconic moment because she is regarded as easily the most influential, the most powerful woman in the country. And here the president had just like literally slapped her down for trying to upstage him for coming late. And of course that was a hallmark of the way in which Winnie conducted herself. And she often worked in subtext. So the youngsters who talk about subtweeting today, Winnie was excellent at subtweeting when she was unhappy about stuff. She'd come late, she'd upstage, and of course she'd play to the gallery in many ways because she was enormously popular. And you would find that in each epoch, when the ANC was in trouble, it's the youngsters who went to her to go and seek guidance. And people often felt that if she gave her blessing, they would have an easier passage, whether it was in the Youth League, in the Women's League, in the African National Congress. So she was a very interesting figure, and she certainly did not play by the rules.
Well, that's certainly true, but she is still being remembered by some this afternoon as an icon, a giant laid to rest at the Methodist Church, saying it thanks God for her life.